My name is Mrs. Bean, and I'm at the Melrose Branch Library. I'm going to be reading the story, The Library Lion, and this is by Michelle Knudsen, illustrated by Kevin Hawks. One day, a lion came to the library. He walked right past the circulation desk and up to the stairs. Mrs. McBee ran down the hall to the head librarian's office. "Mrs. Merriweather," he called. "No running," said Mrs. Merriweather without looking up. "But there's a lion," said Mr. McBee, "in the library." "Is he breaking any rules?" asked Mrs. Merriweather. She was very particular about rule breaking. "Well, no," said Mr. McBee. "Not really. Then leave him alone." Imagine that. The lion wandered all around the library. He sniffed the card catalog. He rubbed his head against the new book collection. He's just having an awesome time, isn't he? Look at that, the card catalog and the new books. Then he padded over to the story corner and went to sleep. No one was sure what to do. There wasn't any rules about lions in the library. That's interesting. Soon it was time for story hour. There weren't any rules about lions at story hour either. The story lady seemed a little nervous, but she read out the first book's title in a good, clear voice. The lion looked up and the story lady just kept on reading. The lion stayed for the next story and the next story after that. He waited for another story, but the children began to walk away. And you know, sometimes that happens. Story hour is over, and a little girl told him, "It's time for you to go." The lion looked at the children. He looked at the story lady. He looked at her close the book, and then he roared very loudly. "Roar," he said. Miss Merriweather came striding out of her office. "Who is that making that noise?" she demanded. "It's the lion," says Mr. McBee. Miss Merriweather marched over to the lion. "If you cannot be quiet, you will have to leave," she said in a stern voice. "Those are the rules." The lion kept roaring. He sounded sad. The little girl tugged Mrs. Merriweather's dress. "If he promises to be quiet, can he come back for another story hour tomorrow?" she asked. The lion stopped roaring. He looked at Miss Merriweather, and Miss Merriweather looked back. Then she said, "Yes, a nice, quiet lion would certainly be allowed to come back for story hour tomorrow." "Hooray!" said the children. "Hooray!" So you see the lion and Miss Merriweather? They're so thankful that he can come back, don't you know? The next day, the lion came back. "You're early," said Miss Merriweather. "The story hour is not until 3 o'clock. The lion did not budge. "Very well," said Mrs. Merriweather. "You might as well make yourself useful." She sent him off to dust the encyclopedias until it was time for story hour. The next day, the lion came early again, but this time, Miss Merriweather asked him to lick all of the envelopes for the overdue notices. So he was very busy, wasn't he? Look at that. Busy, busy, busy. Soon the lion began doing things without being asked. He dusted the encyclopedias, he licked the envelopes. He let small children stand on his back to reach books on the highest shelves. And then he would just curl up in the story corner to wait for story hour to begin. So he really liked stories, didn't he? He loved books, so he was in the right place. At first, the people in the library were nervous about the lion, but soon they got used to having him around. In fact, he seemed very well suited for the library. His big feet were quiet on the library floor. He made a comfy backrest for the children at story hour, and he never roared in the library anymore. What a helpful lion, people asked. They patted his soft head as he walked by. How did we ever get along without this lion? Mr. McBee scowled when he heard that. They had always gotten along fine before. No lions were needed. Lions, he thought, could not understand the rules. They did not belong in the library. One day he had dusted all the encyclopedias off and licked all the envelopes and helped all the small children. The lion padded down the hall to Mrs. Merriweather's office to see what else that he could do. There was still some time left before story hour. "Hello, Lion," said Mrs. Merriweather. "I know something that you can do. You can bring a book back into the stacks for me. Let me just get it down from the shelves." Miss Merriweather stepped up onto the shelf, stepped on the stool. The book was just out of reach, and Miss Merriweather stood on her tippy toes. She stretched out her fingers. "Almost there," she said, and then Miss Merriweather stretched too far. What do you think happened? Let's see. "Ouch," said Mrs. Merriweather. Suddenly, she did not get up. "Mr. McBee," she called after minutes. "Mr. McBee!" But Mr. McBee was at the circulation desk. He could not hear her calling. "Lion," said Mrs. Merriweather, "please go get Mr. McBee." The lion ran down the hall. "No running," Miss Merriweather called after him. The lion put his big front paws up on the circulation desk and looked at Mr. McBee. "Go away, Lion," said Mr. McBee. "I'm busy." Then the lion whined. He pointed his nose down the hall toward Mrs. Merriweather's office. Mr. McBee ignored him. And finally, the lion did the only thing he could think of to do. He looked at Mr. McBee right in his eye. Then he opened his mouth very, very wide and roared the loudest roar he had ever roared in his life. I wonder why he roared. Was he trying to get his attention? He did it the best way he knew how, right? Mr. McBee gasped. "You're not being quiet," he said to the lion. "You're breaking all the rules," he said. Mr. McBee walked down the hall as fast as he could. I think he might have been a little scared too, don't you know? The lion did not follow him. He had broken the rules. He knew what this meant. He hung his head and walked toward the doors. Mr. McBee did not notice. "Miss Merriweather," he called as he walked. Miss Merriweather, the lion had broke the rules, and the lion had broke the rules. Is all he could think about. He burst into Mrs. Merriweather's office. She was not in her chair. "Miss Merriweather," he cried. "Sometimes," said Miss Merriweather from the floor behind her desk, "there is a good reason to break the rules, even in the library. Now please go call the doctor. I think I've broken my arm." Imagine that. Mr. McBee ran to call a doctor. "No running," Miss Merriweather called after him. So she still has her rules, don't you know? The next day, things were back to normal, almost. Miss Merriweather's left arm was in a cast. The doctor had told her not to work too hard. "I will have my lion to help me," Miss Merriweather thought. But the lion did not come to the library that morning. At 3 o'clock, Miss Merriweather walked over to the story corner. The story lady was just beginning a story for the children, and the lion was not there. What do you think the lion was? Do you think he'll come back? Well, we'll see. People in the library kept looking up from their books and computer screens, hoping that they would see a familiar fairy face. But the lion did not come back that day. The lion did not come the next day or the next day after that. One evening, Mr. McBee stopped by Miss Merriweather's office on his way out. "Can I do anything for you before I go, Miss Merriweather?" he asked. "No, thank you," said Miss Merriweather. She was looking out of the window, and her voice was very quiet. even for the library. Mr. McBee frowned as he walked away. He thought there was probably something he could do for Miss Merriweather after all. Mr. McBee left the library, but he did not go home. He walked around the neighborhood. He looked under cars. He looked behind bushes. He looked all over backyards and trash cans and tree houses. He was looking everywhere for this beautiful lion. Finally, he circled the way back to the library. The lion was sitting outside looking through the glass doors. "Hello, lion," said Mr. McBee. The lion did not turn around. "I thought you might like to know," said Mr. McBee, "that there is a new rule at the library. No roaring allowed unless you have a very good reason." So, if you're trying to help a friend who's been hurt, for example, the lion's ears twitched. He turned around, but Mr. McBee was already walking away. The next day, Mr. McBee walked down the hall to see Mrs. Merriweather's office. "What is it, Mr. McBee?" said Mrs. Merriweather in her new, sad, quiet voice. "I thought you might like to know," said Mr. McBee, "that there's a lion in the library." Mrs. Merriweather jumped from her chair and ran down the hall. Mr. McBee smiled. "No running," he called after her. Mrs. Merriweather didn't listen. So do you think she was excited about the lion being back? I think so. Sometimes there was a good reason to break the rules, even in the library. And that's the end of The Library Lion.